Now, so I want to finish what we were talking about with the scientific method. And okay, good. People can see all this. Right. I want to finish what we talked about the scientific method and then try to get into what biology is ultimately about. And the last thing I want to talk about is what science isn't. We've talked a lot about what science is, but let's talk about what it's not. Scientific hypotheses can be totally weird and out there. And as I mentioned, they can be very much creative acts. There's a famous story from chemistry. A fellow named August Kekulé, who was German, worked out or came up with a hypothesis for the formula of a very important compound called benzene because he saw it in a dream. I know of at least two scientists who got great ideas while hallucinating on one was, I think both it was LSD. People come up with all kinds of ideas and they can be pretty out there, and how you get them can be pretty wild. But the ultimate judge of whether it's science or not is not how weird it sounds, it's whether you can put it to some kind of test. If I told you I have unicorns living in my closet, that's weird, but it's testable because you or anybody could, in principle, go to my closet, open the door, and see if I had unicorns. Untestable statements aren't scientific, and they've got no place in science. They are out of bounds. That doesn't mean that they are useless. In fields like art and literature and philosophy, they can be very important. It's just that they don't work with science's particular mental toolkit. Science is not the only way of thinking, but within that way of thinking, statements have to be testable to be ultimately valid. There has to be some way in which you can say, okay, how do we put this through some kind of test? That test may not always be an experiment. There are some fields like astronomy for which you can't do experiments because we can't fit a star in the laboratory. There might be other fields for which experiments are practically impossible or unethical. Experiments that involve, removing people's brains or something like that might be physically possible, but not ethical to do, or, not practical to do, or both. But you still have to test hypotheses, if not with experiments, with model building, with direct observations, all those things that we've talked about. And a scientific statement has to be falsifiable. There has to be some way that you could disprove it, that you could find evidence to reject it. You always have to construct hypotheses in such a way that you can say, okay, if we find such and such evidence, I will reject my hypothesis and go on and do something else. This is where a lot of conspiracy theories go off the rails. I don't want to talk too much about politics, but you've probably heard about QAnon, this conspiracy theory that there's a bunch of baby-eating pedophiles in government and big business, and the president was supposed to work undercover to identify these people and then was suddenly going to swoop in and arrest them all. That's a hypothesis. Okay, it could happen, but the Q people kept pushing back the date for when this was going to happen. And when Trump left and Biden was inaugurated in, many of them were pretty upset because this wasn't supposed to happen according to the conspiracy theory that they believed in. What's happening now is they're coming up with ways in which it can still be true. Okay, maybe it'll happen on March 4th. Okay, maybe Biden is in on it. Okay, maybe Donald Trump was one of the baby eaters all along, or something like that. again, I don't particularly want to talk about the politics of the whole thing, except the point is that you cannot keep moving the goalposts like that if you're doing science. You can't keep changing your hypothesis to say, okay, it could still be true. Um, let's say I hypothesize that there is a 6-foot bunny rabbit named Harvey that follows me everywhere. Okay, that's a testable hypothesis because you could test it by looking at me and saying, I don't see a 6-foot bunny rabbit. But if I say there is a 6-foot bunny rabbit and nobody can see him except for the people who already believe in him, that's not scientific because there's no way to falsify that. The flat earth is falsifiable. There is evidence that we could gather that would disprove the existence of a flat earth. But when I've actually talked with flat earth theorists, any evidence you give them, they'll come up with a way to reject. If nothing else, they can always say, yeah, that evidence was just made up by the round earth conspiracy and you must be part of it too. There is no evidence that you could present that would get these people to reject their hypothesis. And when it gets to that point, you're not doing science anymore. All of the ideas that I'm going to talk about could be falsified. We have a lot of confidence in them, but there is still the potential that they could end up being disproven in the form that we have them now. Everything I teach you could be wrong. It probably isn't, but there's always a chance it could be. But if you have a statement that cannot ever be shown to be wrong by any evidence that's out there, you're not doing science anymore. Okay, that's important. There's a lot of bad science and non-science out there, and it's important, especially in this day and age, to be able to tell the difference. Right. Aside from conspiracy theories and, wacky things like that, and aside from, 6-foot rabbits following you around, here are some things that are, not necessarily bad, but that just don't work as science. One example is statements about aesthetics. We can test things like, what song is more popular, but ultimately trying to figure out what, whether a piece of art, a song, a painting, or anything like that is ultimately better art is not the kind of thing you can test. We could test statements like Rihanna is more popular than Taylor Swift. We could test that by looking at data on record sales and concert tickets, ticket sales, and things like that. We could test that hypothesis. But as for the question, who is better, who makes better art, there's no way we could test that because you have to decide what better means, and nobody's been able to figure that out. There's a lot of art that is very meaningful to a lot of people, even though by common standards, it may not seem like good art. There's lots of outsider art like that that's absolutely amazing. So there's no real way to test aesthetic statements like that. Scientific statements also have to be very precise. And that's why a lot of branches of science use math, because math forces you to be precise about what you mean. And the same is true for all of the words that we're going to learn. Someone told me once that in a typical majors course for biology, you have to learn more vocabulary in a year than you do in the equivalent amount of a foreign language course. I try to cut back on that when I can, but there's still an awful lot of words that have to be used if you're going to do science. Some of you probably know the vocabulary we're going to cover already, but I promise you there's a lot more. And the reason is not just to impress people by your ability to say deoxyribonucleic acid undergoes transcription in the nucleus and then ribonucleic acid is transcribed on the ribosomes. No, That's a nice party trick. But the reason you need equations and you need precise words is because hypotheses have to have very precise meanings. We can't test the hypothesis that when the sun shines on plants, stuff happens, right? You have to define what exactly you're talking about by stuff, right? You have to be specific for what you mean by stuff in order to test that, because stuff happens could mean almost anything. So statements that are fuzzy aren't scientific. Big one, moral statements are not scientific. And we sometimes call this distinction the difference between is and ought, or the dichotomy between fact and value. Science can explain why the world is the way it is, and we can predict what will happen if you do certain things, but you cannot get from there to a moral imperative. Science can tell you what is likely to happen if everybody wears masks in public, as opposed to what happens if everybody doesn't. In fact, we've already seen by looking at different parts of the country what happens when everybody wears a mask compares to where few people wear masks. COVID spreads a lot faster in areas where you don't. But you can't go from there to tell everybody that they should wear masks, because some people are going to say, yes, I know that it saves lives, but in my personal morality, I value freedom more than I do saving lives. Science can't give you an answer to a statement like that. Science can't make you adopt a particular set of values. Science can tell you what happens if you jump on a railroad track in front of an oncoming train. We could predict what will happen to your body. We could maybe calculate, what direction your head is going to go flying in. We can do all of that. What we can't do is tell you that it's morally wrong to jump out on a track in front of a train. Okay. We can't tell you that preserving your life is more important than destroying it like that. That has to come from somewhere else. That's why we make you take courses in, philosophy, for example, as part of the core. There are other philosophical tools for thinking about morals and values and things like that that are useful, but they're not what science deals in. Science is a very powerful toolkit, but every tool can only do so many things. Related to that, statements about religion and spirituality, statements like Jesus saves people from sin, or Odin wants you to hang your enemies from trees after you've defeated them in battle and then stab them in the chest. Now, there are plenty of scientists who hold very sincere religious beliefs and follow them. In the biology department at UCA, we don't really keep track of such things. A lot of my colleagues, I've never asked, whether they go to church or not. But for the ones that I do know, I can tell you that in the time I've been here, we've had, and we have now, faculty members that are devout Christians who walk the walk as far as I'm able to judge such things. They seem like they're very observant of the values of that faith. We have agnostics, we have atheists. In the time that I've been here, we've had at least one person who was Jewish, a couple who were raised Hindu, one Sikh, at least one Buddhist, and two pagans. And it doesn't really make that much difference in terms of the science that we do. It's not a requirement to be an atheist to be a good scientist. There are some pretty outspoken atheists who are scientists, who have been pretty vocal in recent years, but it's not required. There are plenty of perfectly good scientists who are sincere religious believers of one form or another. The problem comes when you try to test religious statements by the scientific method. Things start getting weird. And instead of just telling you this, I'll show you. Back in 1999, a group of medical researchers took 990 patients who were admitted here to the coronary care unit of the Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, meaning that they just had heart attacks, blocked blood vessel feeding the heart itself. So as the patients were admitted, they were randomly assigned to either an experimental or a control group. The patients weren't told whether they were in the experimental or the control group, because remember, the placebo effect can be very powerful here. All the patients got, as much as possible, the same treatment, the same doctors. They all had heart attacks of about the same severity. You know, you wouldn't want to put the mild heart attack patients in one group and the very severe ones in a different group. The groups were matched as much as you ever can. The only difference is that the experimental group's name were given to the prayer team of a local church, and the people on the church's prayer team prayed for them to the Christian God, I might add, for 4 weeks. And it turned out that when that was done, the experimental groups, the people who were assigned to the experimental group, did better than the control group. Fewer members of the experimental group died. Members of the experimental group experienced fewer complications, and they were discharged from the hospital sooner. That looks like a really good experiment. And the people setting it up did make it as good an experiment as they can. As I've mentioned, they matched the experimental and the control group as best you can in a situation like this. All of the patients got the same medical care, the same doctors, the same facility. So it's not like the experimental group got the best doctor and the control group, got, Dr. Doofus. They all got as much as you ever can, the same care. The patients weren't told, so it's not the placebo effect. If you tell patients, hey, the whole church is praying for you, that might psychologically make them get better, even if there is no physical effect. So they did everything right. They did the experiment very well. The problem is that the other thing for valid science is that you have to repeat your experiment or your observations and get the same results. If I do a chemistry experiment and I get some sort of chemical, if I mix chemical A and chemical B and I get compound Z, anybody in the world should be able to do what I did, mix the same chemicals and get the same results. If I'm testing a drug and, I conclude that after testing it on 1,000 people, my wonder pills are effective, anybody in the world should be able to repeat the test and get the same results. And the problem is that as of 2007, 17 attempts had been made to repeat the experiment that was done in Kansas City. And the problem is that they can't find it again. The follow-up studies have not confirmed the results of that Kansas City study. So the effect is not reproducible. In fact, in one study, patients who knew they were being prayed for had more complications than patients who didn't. And this may be an example of the negative placebo effect. By the way, that's called the nocebo effect, technically. I won't test you on that, but that's what a negative placebo is. What they think was happening is that if you tell a patient, hey, the whole commando prayer squad of First Baptist Church of Texarkana is praying for you, that actually has a bad effect on their minds. They're thinking the Commando Prayer Squad of the First Baptist Church of Texarkana. Oh, I must be really serious. I must be really, really sick if they're praying for me. And it might actually make them a little worse. There was a study in California that did find a positive effect of prayer, but they found it didn't matter who was being prayed to, because they did an experiment like this, but people got assigned to either no prayer, a Christian group, a group of Buddhists, or some Native Americans practitioners who did their own spiritual practice, whatever it might be. And it turned out that the people who were being prayed for did get a little better, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter who was being prayed to. And most of the studies haven't shown a beneficial effect at all. So I'm not going to tell you that prayer doesn't help people. Some of you might have in your experience have heard that it does, and I don't want to tell you that you're wrong. The point is that when you try to subject this to a rigorous test, the results are all over the map. We cannot reproduce the effect consistently. It's also extremely hard to make an experiment like that valid. If I'm testing a medicine, then my experimental group gets the medicine and my control group doesn't. If my control group is secretly, getting the medicine, then my experiment's not valid because I no longer have that variable under control. So, some of the people who were admitted to that hospital with a heart attack were probably already being prayed for anyway by their families, maybe by their own churches and things like that. So how can you be sure that the control group in an experiment like this is not getting prayed for? And the answer is you can't. We don't have any way to stop someone from getting prayers. All right, there's no, anti-prayer shield or anything like that. This raises some kind of scary theological questions as well, because it makes it, if prayer like that does heal people, it makes it look as if God might be healing people on the basis of a popularity contest. Most people I don't think would be comfortable with God saying, okay, 50 people are praying for this guy, so I'll heal him. This other guy's only got 35 people praying for him, so he can just die. I don't really want to answer that, and it's not my place to talk about the nature of God, but the implications for religion may not be as positive as some people think. It may be better for religious belief as well as for science if you don't try to test religious postulates to a rigorous scientific method. Maybe a fence between them is probably the best way to go. This doesn't mean, as I've said, that scientists have to be atheists or agnostics. As I've already said, plenty of scientists are religious of one form or another. And it certainly doesn't mean that we don't feel amazement and wonder at the world. There are times I can be staring down the barrel of a microscope and suddenly go, dang. We study some pretty amazing things, and we feel the same kind of amazement at them that religious believers might feel in a great cathedral or something like that. But it does mean that when we're working as scientists, we don't blend science with the supernatural. You can't really do science that way. The mental toolkit that you use to think about religions and gods and ultimate questions of destiny, that's just not the right toolkit to use on scientific questions. So there. Now, the science that we're studying in this course, of course, is biology. So I want to finish up by talking about what biology is. Biology is the science of life. That, of course, that raises the question, what exactly is life? The answer is there's no perfect definition of life. We can define what life looks like on planet Earth, every so often we have to modify our definition. We will encounter things coming up, viruses, for example, that are actually kind of fuzzy, that don't clearly belong either with living things or with non-living things. It'll be a while before I can talk about viruses, but let's just say right for now that they're kind of on the borderline. Is the CoV2 virus that's causing COVID-19, is that living or not? The answer is kind of. And much later, I'll talk about why that's the case. For right now, if we need just a working definition of what life is, we can come up with common properties that living things have on planet Earth. It's possible that if there's life on other planets, it might violate some of these conditions. But the first is chemistry. Living things are made up primarily of the chemical elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And as we'll see, the elements phosphorus and sulfur are structurally important, even though we don't have quite as much of those as we do carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. So if you want to, you can remember schnapps as the chemical elements that make up living things. There are others that are important. If you study nutrition, you might know that you need, iron and zinc and calcium and all those other things that you can, buy supplements for. And those are used. There's actually a role for most of the natural chemical elements in life, but they're not as abundant and they're not as universally important. But you can't build life without CHON and then also a dash of potassium and sulfur. So you can't make life as we know it without schnapps. Schnapps atoms are put together, and when you have two or more atoms that are sticking together into a shape, you call that shape a molecule. I'm assuming most of you had this, by the way, in high school biology and chemistry and things like that. If I go slowly in this class, it's not because I'm condescending. I assume that you're all geniuses who just don't want to be biologists, but not everybody coming in here has equal backgrounds in this. So it's always good to go over the really basic stuff. And so if I'm talking about stuff that's really basic for you, I'm not trying to talk down to you. I'm just making sure that we're all starting from the same point. So molecules are what you get when you stick atoms together, and living things consist of a ridiculously large number of complicated molecules. And organisms take in energy and matter from the outside. If you're a plant, you take in energy from the sun, and you take in matter in the form of carbon dioxide gas from the air and water and minerals from the soil. If you're an animal, you take in both energy and matter from the food that you eat, and you use these to build up your own molecules and also break them down. You are constantly building new molecules of yourself and breaking down old ones. The process of building up is called anabolism. You might have heard of anabolic steroids. Those are the ones that athletes inject, even though they're not supposed to build up muscle, to encourage the body to make more of the molecules that you need for muscles. The breakdown is called catabolism, and the sum of both of them, shown in this diagram that you see, this is a small part of what we call metabolism. You're constantly taking in molecules and energy from the outside, building up new ones for yourself, and breaking down old ones for yourself. And this is always going on. The reason why you use schnapps is, and not others, is that those particular atoms happen to fit together to build a ridiculously large number of possible molecules. I always think of Legos here. Um, if you built Legos as a kid, there are Lego parts like, I don't know, helicopter rotors or things like that are really only good for one thing, right? You can't do much with a Lego helicopter rotor except put it on a helicopter. On the other hand, those really simple Legos that just have, 1, 2, 4, 6, or 8 little dots on them, you can put those together in any combination you want to, and you can build the freaking Empire State Building life size if you've got enough of those. There's no real limit to the number of sizes and shapes you can make from the basic Legos. And you can think of schnapps as being the equivalents of the basic Legos. You can put those together to make enormously large molecules. Really, really big ones we call macromolecules. And there's 4 main classes of those. Carbohydrates, which are made mostly of just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That includes sugars and starches. Lipids, which includes fats and oils and waxes. Proteins, which do a hell of a lot of stuff. And a 4th type called nucleic acids, which includes things you might have heard of like DNA and RNA. I'm not going to say much about these things just yet. You are going to see many of these in an upcoming hands-on lab. I don't think it's for several weeks, but you are going to work with these in a future lab. You'll be hearing more than you ever dreamed possible about proteins and nucleic acids when we're about halfway through the course. So we'll get to all of this later. For right now, you just need to know macromolecules and the 4 basic types of them, and we'll come back to that. The macromolecules assemble into subunits called cells. We'll talk more pretty soon about what's in a cell. We're not really going to get down to the nitty-gritty until towards the end of the course. For the moment, what you're looking at in this picture is a view through a microscope of the leaf of a water plant called Elodea. In an upcoming in-person lab, you'll be looking at Elodea yourself, and you'll see something like this. This is what an Elodea leaf looks like, magnified about 100 times. And it turns out that the leaf is made up of what look like very long boxes stuck together on all sides. Each box contains a bunch of green dots. Each one of those big boxes is a cell. What does a cell do? Well, a cell carries out metabolism. Each one of those cells in the Elodea leaf is taking in energy and taking up small molecules and building them up and breaking them down. Cells store genetic material, this stuff called DNA that we'll talk about much later. And every cell has a boundary separating the outside from the inside. The boundary of a cell is called the plasma membrane, and anything that the cell needs passes in through the plasma membrane. Cells also export molecules out of the plasma membrane, and things that the cell doesn't need to an extent can be blocked from crossing the plasma membrane. We'll get into much more. Every one of these slides could be the subject of a course, but we will soon get into more detail about what exactly cells are and what they do. So that's coming up. One of the macromolecules, one of the most important ones, is a very complex molecule. You're looking at a model of it where the atoms are represented by what look like little ping pong balls. This is not exactly what atoms look like, but it will do. And this is just one small portion of an extremely large molecule called DNA, short for deoxyribonucleic acid. You will learn so much about DNA in this course that you're going to be begging me to stop by the time we're done. We'll finally get a fairly complete picture about 2/3 of the way through. For now, know right now that DNA carries information, just like a paper with words on it, or a piece of magnetic tape, or a strip of film carries information. It carries information in an encoded form about how the living thing is supposed to carry out metabolism and otherwise carry out its life processes and do what it does. And we'll crack the code once we've gotten through some preliminary material first. Just know for right now that DNA carries information. Okay, DNA carries information and organisms use. Okay, Bailey, yeah, you're here. I'm sorry I didn't unmute your mic if you don't mind, unless you need to tell me something. I'm sorry I didn't let you in until now. I don't always see these things as they happen.
Yes, sir. I've been in, but my own computer had shut down, so I had been on. I rejoined on my phone. I've been in the whole time. I
Okay,
thought I had missed something.
okay, all right,
All right. All right.
all right. Organisms use DNA to pass on their features to future generations. You look like your biological parents because whatever else they gave you DNA passed on in their egg and sperm cells back when you were conceived. And this is true for all living things. You know, your cats, your garden plants, the weeds in your lawn, the bacteria in your intestines, all of those have the features that they do because they have DNA that's passed on from previous generations. That's called heredity, and it's the main theme of the middle third of the course. Organisms can regulate their own internal processes to maintain a stable state, like this guy sitting on a unicycle. If your environment gets hot, your body has ways of cooling down, like turning pink, flushing, and sweating. If your environment gets cold, your body has ways of generating heat and keeping it. And so your body temperature stays very stable. It varies a tiny bit, but it stays pretty stable, you know, unless you have something like heat stroke or you're freezing to death. You know, it's not infinite, but within a wide range of conditions, you maintain a steady 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. And the same is true for the amount of water in your body, the amount of salt, how acid, how alkaline it is. Your body and all living things, to an extent, can regulate their own internal processes to maintain internal stability. We call that homeostasis. Organisms can sense their environment and respond to it, whether it's plants growing towards the sun, you seeing the screen right now, this pit viper tasting the air and using those pits below its eyes to sense heat of tasty little animals that it can eat. Living things sense and respond to their environment. Populations of living things shift their features over many generations in response to shifts in the environment. That's the basics of the dreaded E word, evolution. Populations adapt to their environment, or if they can't, they end up like T-Rex over here and go extinct. Evolution, all it is change in populations over time. And we'll talk about that coming up pretty soon. Last thing, every organism interacts with its own environment and with other organisms in its environment. Every organism responds to things like light, water, temperature, and with the other organisms that live with it, compete with it, eat it, get eaten by it. And so every living thing is interacting with many other living things in the environment in very complex ways. There's no such thing as a lone organism. And the study of that is what we call ecology. All of these we're going to cover in some way in the upcoming course. And I believe that is about time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.